Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this: the gentle hum of jet engines mixing with the clink of ice cubes in real glass tumblers, the faint scent of cigarette smoke drifting through recycled air, mingling with the aroma of hot meals being wheeled down narrow aisles on metal carts. People dressed like they were going somewhere important, even if they were just visiting family 3 states over. That specific kind of excitement that made your stomach flutter as the wheels left the ground. If you flew in the 1980s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It wasn't just travel, it was an event. Welcome back to Time-Washed Stories. I'm so glad you're here with me today as we take this trip down memory lane together. If you're new here, or if you've been with us for a while and haven't hit that subscribe button yet, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a second to do that now. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep exploring these forgotten corners of the past together. Stay with me until the end, because there are a few little moments from those flights that people almost never talk about anymore. The kind of details that slip through the cracks of memory, but somehow meant everything when you were living them. And if I forget something you remember, feel free to remind me in the comments. Sometimes the best memories are the ones we piece together. The journey really began long before you ever sat down in your seat. It started the moment you walked through those airport doors, and already you could feel that something was different. The airport itself had a certain energy to it in the 80s. There was no 3-hour early arrival recommendation, no snaking security lines that seemed to stretch back toward the parking garage. You could show up maybe 45 minutes before your flight. Stroll up to the ticket counter with your paper ticket in hand, check your suitcase, and still have time to grab a cup of coffee before boarding. Security existed, sure, but it was this almost casual thing. You'd walk through a metal detector, maybe they'd glance at your carry-on bag, and that was about it. No removing shoes, no separating laptops you didn't own yet anyway, no emptying your pockets of every coin and key. It sounds almost careless now, doesn't it? But back then, that's just how it was. Flying felt accessible, open. The barriers between you and that airplane were so much thinner. I remember walking through airports with my parents and feeling like we were part of something bigger. The terminals hummed with this particular kind of anticipation. Families gathered at the gates, people who weren't even flying, just there to see someone off or welcome them home. Kids pressed their faces against the giant windows, watching planes taxi and take off, breath fogging up the glass. There was something about being able to walk right up to the gate without a boarding pass, to wave goodbye until your person disappeared down the jetway, that made the whole experience feel more connected, more human somehow. The fashion alone could tell you this was an event worth dressing for. Men wore slacks and collared shirts, sometimes full suits and ties, even on domestic flights. Women wore dresses or coordinated outfits, heels, jewelry that wasn't just a wedding band. People treated flying like they were going to a nice restaurant or maybe the theater. There was this unspoken understanding that you presented yourself a certain way when you traveled by air. Even kids were dressed neatly, little boys in their miniature button-ups, and girls in dresses with Mary Janes. It wasn't about showing off. It was just what you did. Air travel still carried that weight of formality, that remnant of when flying was reserved for the wealthy or the important. When your flight was finally called, there was this little surge of energy. Everyone stood up, gathered their things, and formed a line that was somehow both orderly and eager. No zones, no groups 1 through 9, just a general boarding call, and you moved toward the gate agent who would tear your paper ticket, hand you back your stub, and send you down that jetway with a smile. Walking onto the plane itself was like entering a different world. The first thing that hit you was the smell. It's hard to describe exactly, but if you were there, you know it. A combination of recycled air, cleaning solution, jet fuel, and something else. Something distinctly airplane. The carpet under your feet was usually some bold, geometric pattern, blues and oranges and browns, very of its time. The overhead bins were smaller, and people carried less, so there was rarely that frantic scramble for space. We see now, the seats themselves were different too. They had more padding somehow, even in economy. The fabric was usually this thick, textured material, sometimes in patterns that matched the carpet, and the legroom. You actually had it. Your knees didn't immediately press into the seat in front of you the moment you sat down. You could cross your legs if you wanted. You could shift without feeling like you were invading someone else's space. The seats reclined generously too, and no one seemed to get into arguments about it. It was just understood that everyone reclined. That's what the button was for. The cabin felt cozier somehow, even though the planes were often full. Maybe it was the lighting, softer and warmer than the harsh LEDs we have now. Maybe it was just the pace of everything. Once you found your seat and settled in, there was this collective exhale. The overhead bins would close with these solid, reassuring clicks. People would tuck their coats beside them or overhead, arrange their newspapers or magazines, and then just wait. No one was frantically trying to get the Wi-Fi password or charge their phone before takeoff. You just sat there with your thoughts or your book or your conversation with whoever was beside you. And speaking of sitting beside someone, there was much more of a chance you'd actually talk to them without screens and smartphones to disappear into. People struck up conversations. You'd learn that the woman in the window seat was visiting her daughter in Phoenix. The businessman in the aisle was heading to a conference in Chicago. The college kid next to you was going home for Thanksgiving. These little exchanges happened naturally, not forced, just the result of having nothing else to do but be present with the people around you. Before the plane even took off, the flight attendants would come through with the safety demonstration, but they did it in person, standing right there in the aisle, holding up the actual oxygen mask and life vest. You could see their faces. They made eye contact. It felt personal in a way that's been lost to those video screens that everyone ignores now. The attendants themselves seemed different too. The uniform standards were strict. Hair pulled back just so, makeup perfect, shoes polished. They carried themselves with this professionalism that made you feel like you were in capable hands. Once you were in the air and the seatbelt sign dinged off, things really began. The drink cart would come rolling down that narrow aisle, and this is where you started to see just how different the service was. Flight attendants didn't just hand you a small plastic cup with ice and a splash of soda. They offered you real drinks in real glassware. If you ordered a Coke, they'd bring you the whole can, along with a glass full of ice. If you wanted a cocktail, they'd mix it right there on the cart, with actual mini bottles and proper proportions. Coffee came in real cups with real saucers. Even the stirrers were metal sometimes. And the drinks were often free, even in economy, especially on longer flights. You could have a beer, a glass of wine, a cocktail, and no one pulled out a credit card. It was just part of the experience, part of what you got when you bought your ticket. The flight attendants would chat with you as they poured. They'd remember if you wanted extra ice or no ice. They'd check back to see if you needed a refill. There was time for that kind of attention. The service felt generous, unhurried. The sound of those carts moving through the cabin became part of the flight's rhythm. The metallic rattle, the clink of bottles and glasses, the murmur of people ordering, thanking, settling back with their drinks in hand. And because this was the 80s, a lot of people were smoking while they drank. I know for those of us who remember this, it seems wild to think about now, but smoking on planes was completely normal. Throughout most of the decade, there were designated sections, smoking in the back, non-smoking in the front. Though anyone who flew then knows that smoke doesn't really respect invisible boundaries in a sealed metal tube at 30,000 feet. The smell permeated everything. If you sat in non-smoking, you could still smell it. If you sat in smoking, well, you were living in it. Flight attendants would walk down the aisles collecting used ashtrays built right into the armrests, little metal flip-up things. People would light up right after the seatbelt sign went off. sometimes before the drink cart even arrived. The ritual of it, tapping the cigarette pack, lighting up that first exhale, was just woven into the fabric of the flight. For smokers, it was probably one of the last places they could indulge without restriction. For everyone else, it was just something you tolerated because that's how it was. But then the meal service would start, and honestly, that almost made up for everything else. The smell of food heating up in those galleon ovens would start wafting through the cabin, and you'd realize just how hungry you actually were. The flight attendants would come through with those trays, and this wasn't just a bag of pretzels and a prayer. This was a full meal. Even in economy, you'd get a hot entree, maybe chicken with some kind of sauce, or beef or pasta. It came on a real tray with a real plate. Not always, but often enough. There'd be a side of vegetables, a roll with butter, a little salad with actual dressing in a tiny container, and a dessert. Sometimes it was cake. Sometimes it was a little cup of fruit or pudding, and it came with real silverware, metal forks and knives, not the plastic stuff we have now. The meals weren't gourmet by any stretch, let's be honest. Airplane food was already the butt of jokes even then. But there was something about the ritual of it, the way the flight attendant would hand you this warm tray, the way you'd unfold your tray table and arrange everything, peel back the foil, salt and pepper your food. It made the flight feel like more than just transportation. You were being taken care of. You were being served. And on longer flights, especially international ones, the service was even more elaborate. You might get multiple courses, a starter, a main, cheese and crackers, wine with dinner, coffee or tea with dessert. The flight attendants would come through with hot towels before the meal, warm and rolled up with little tongs, so you could freshen up. These small touches added up. They made the hours in the air feel less like an ordeal and more like an experience. I think one of the things that made flying in the 80s so distinct was how much interaction there was with the crew. Flight attendants weren't just there to enforce rules and deliver snacks. They were hosts. They'd stop and chat. They'd bring extra drinks without you asking. They'd warm up a bottle for a baby. They'd bring kids little wing pins or decks of playing cards branded with the airline logo. If you were traveling alone, especially if you were nervous, they'd check in on you, make sure you were comfortable. There was a warmth to it, a genuine care that's harder to find now when crews are stretched so thin and flights are packed so tight. The pace of the flight itself was different too. Things took time, but no one seemed to mind. The drink service might take 45 minutes to make its way through the whole cabin. The meal service could take over an hour, and then there'd be another drink service later. Then maybe coffee and tea. The flight attendants were constantly moving, but it never felt rushed. And between services, there were long stretches where you'd just sit there, and that was okay. You'd read, you'd doze, you'd look out the window at the clouds, you'd think. On long-haul flights, especially overnight ones, the cabin would take on this particular quality. Once the meal was done and the lights were dimmed, people would settle in with their thin airplane blankets and flat pillows, trying to find a comfortable position in seats that reclined, but never quite enough. The white noise of the engines became almost soothing after a while. You'd see little reading lights dotted throughout the dark cabin where people were finishing chapters or working on crossword puzzles. Sometimes you'd wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and pad back to the bathroom, passing rows of sleeping strangers, all of you suspended together in this strange in-between space. The bathrooms, by the way, were tiny even then, but they had these little details that felt more permanent, more substantial. The metal fixtures, the heavy doors. Sometimes there'd be actual lotion in a dispenser, or cologne, or mouthwash in little paper cups. It wasn't luxury, but it was thoughtful. Someone had considered that you might want to freshen up after 7 hours in the air. Flying with family added its own dimension to the experience. Kids were just expected to entertain themselves more. There were no seatback screens, no tablets loaded with movies and games. Maybe you brought a book or some crayons and a coloring book. Maybe your parents let you have the window seat, and you spent hours watching the ground far below, spotting rivers and roads and towns that looked like toys, or you'd play with whatever little toy you'd brought from home, making up stories to pass the time. I remember the excitement of getting to fly somewhere was immense. It wasn't something most families did often. A flight meant vacation, or visiting grandparents who lived far away, or maybe moving to a new city. It was special. The whole family would dress up. Your parents would be slightly tense about making the flight on time, but also excited. There'd be this buzz of anticipation that made everything feel bigger, more important. Looking out the window during takeoff, feeling the plane lift and tilt, watching the ground fall away. That feeling was pure magic every single time. And vacation flights had their own particular character. Planes heading to Florida or Hawaii or the Caribbean in the summer were filled with families, all of them sunburned on the way home. Exhausted kids clutching stuffed animals from gift shops, parents already half asleep before takeoff. There was a looseness to these flights, a collective relaxation. People would swap stories about where they'd been, what they'd seen. The flight attendants seemed more relaxed too, like they were part of the vacation vibe. Business travel was different, of course. Flights on Monday mornings and Thursday evenings were filled with men in suits, briefcases tucked under the seat in front of them, spreading out papers to work, or reading the Wall Street Journal with their coffee. These flights were quieter, more focused. Everyone had somewhere to be. But even then, there was still that service, those meals, those drinks. Business travelers were probably the most comfortable with the routine of flying, doing it week after week. But I think even they appreciated the small comforts that made those repetitive trips more bearable. The airlines themselves had personalities back then in a way that feels less distinct now. You knew if you were flying Pan Am or TWA or Eastern or Continental. They had different color schemes, different uniform styles, different little touches in their service. Some airlines were known for better meals. Some had friendlier staff. Some had newer planes. People had preferences and loyalties. My parents always tried to fly a certain airline, if they could, because they liked how they did things. It mattered. And then there was that moment, as the flight started its descent, when the captain would come on the intercom and tell you about the weather at your destination. The local time, thank you for flying with us. The flight attendants would come through one more time to collect any remaining cups or trash. To make sure your tray table was up and your seat was forward, you'd look out the window and start to see the ground getting closer, the details coming back into focus. Houses, cars, trees, the abstract becoming concrete again. That final approach, the way your stomach would lift slightly as the plane descended, the gear coming down with a solid thunk. You could feel through the floor, the ground rushing up, and then that little skip and screech as the wheels touched down. The reverse thrust of the engines, loud and powerful, slowing you down. And then the turn onto the taxiway, the slow roll toward the gate, people already starting to gather their things, even though the seatbelt sign was still on. When you finally got off the plane, there was always this moment of adjustment. The air smelled different. The light looked different. You were somewhere else now. And if someone was picking you up, they were right there at the gate, waiting, watching for your face in the crowd coming off the plane. That moment of recognition, of reunion, right there in the terminal. It completed the journey in a way that feels lost now, when you're texting from baggage claim and meeting at the curb. Flying in the 80s wasn't perfect. The smoking was genuinely unpleasant for many people. The planes were louder. Safety standards weren't quite what they are now. Flights were often more expensive when you adjust for inflation, which meant fewer people could afford to fly regularly. And certainly, the industry had its problems, its inequalities, its limitations. But there was something about the experience that felt more human-scaled, more connected to the people around you and the act of traveling itself. It was slower, yes, but that slowness created space for small moments. A conversation with a stranger, the patience to read an entire book, the simple pleasure of a hot meal at 30,000 feet, the wonder of watching the sun set from above the clouds with nothing else to do but watch. We traded that away for speed, for efficiency, for lower prices, and maybe that trade-off was worth it. More people can fly now. More people can visit family or see the world that matters. But I do think something was lost in the exchange, something about the ritual and the care and the sense that flying was still special, still something worth dressing up for, still something to be savored rather than endured. When you talk to people who flew in the 80s, there's often this wistfulness in their voices. Not everything was better, they'll tell you, but some things were, and then they'll remember some small detail. The weight of real silverware, the sound of ice in a glass tumbler, the smell of coffee brewing in the galley, the way a flight attendant remembered their name. These memories feel soft now, worn smooth by time, but they're still there, still real. They're part of what travel used to mean, back when the journey was as important as the destination, back when being 30,000 feet in the air still felt like something worth paying attention to. Thank you for taking this trip with me today, for spending some time up in the clouds, remembering what it felt like to fly when flying still felt like flying. I'd love to hear your memories in the comments. What do you remember most about flights in the 80s? Was there something I didn't mention that stood out to you? A particular flight you took that stayed with you? And if there's another time or place you'd like me to explore in a future video, let me know. These stories belong to all of us, and I love hearing what resonates with you. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.